The morning sun painted my ranch in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the pasture where my horses grazed in peaceful silence. Steam rose from my coffee mug as I stood on the wraparound porch, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and prairie grass that had greeted me every morning for the past 37 years. The only sounds were the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance and the rhythmic creak of the old windmill that had stood, sentinel over this land since my grandfather's time. Then I heard it, the distant thrum of helicopter, blades cutting through the morning air, a sound that had become as routine as birdsong over the past few years. The military choppers passed overhead in perfect formation, their shadows racing across the golden fields like dark birds of prey. I raised my hand in a casual salute, knowing the pilots couldn't see me but feeling the familiar surge of pride that came with supporting our nation's defense training right here on my own land. The helicopters faded into the distance, leaving behind only the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. I was about to head inside to start the day's work when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing at my front gate, silhouetted against the morning light, like some harbinger of doom. Margaret Penworth, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, stood ramrod straight in her crisp white blazer, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. In her manicured hands, she clutched a manila envelope like it was a weapon. I set down my coffee and walked toward the gate, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway that had been worn smooth by 3 generations of my family's footsteps. Margaret's pale blue eyes tracked my movement with predatory intensity, and I could see the satisfaction playing across her thin lips, the look of someone who believed they held all the cards. "Morning, Margaret," I called out, my voice steady despite the knot forming in my stomach. "Little early for a social call, isn't it?" She didn't return my greeting. Instead, she thrust the envelope through the iron bars of my gate like she was serving a warrant. "This is official business, Mr. Harrison. Consider yourself formally notified." I took the envelope, noting how her perfectly manicured nails had left small indentations in the manila surface. The weight of it felt wrong in my hands. Too heavy for simple correspondence, too light for the magnitude of trouble I suspected it contained. Notified of what? I asked, though part of me already knew. The HOA had been circling my property like vultures for months, looking for any excuse to sink their claws into land that had never been, and would never be, part of their pristine suburban paradise. Margaret's smile was sharp as a knife edge. "Open it and find out. I think you'll find the contents illuminating." My fingers worked at the envelope's seal, and I could feel her watching every movement, savoring each second of what she clearly believed would be my impending humiliation. The papers inside rustled with the sound of expensive legal stationery, and as I unfolded them, the morning sun seemed to dim. "Notice of violation and demand for compliance," read the header in bold, aggressive letters. Below it, paragraph after paragraph of legal jargon outlined the HOA's position with cold, clinical precision. They claimed my ranch violated community aesthetic standards. They demanded I remove all livestock from the property within 30 days. They ordered me to tear down the split-rail fences that had bordered my land since before most of their cookie-cutter houses had even been blueprints. Most shocking of all, they wanted me to cease all agricultural operations and conform to their vision of what my ancestral land should become. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, not from fear, but from rage that started deep in my chest and spread through my veins like wildfire. How dare they? How dare these suburban transplants, with their identical lawns and their homeowners' covenants, think they could dictate the fate of land that had been in my family since before their grandparents were born? "This is ridiculous," I said. my voice low and controlled, despite the storm raging inside me. "You have no authority over my property. I'm not even part of your association." Margaret's laugh was like ice cracking. "Oh, but we do have authority, Mr. Harrison. You see, the county has been very cooperative in updating zoning ordinances. Your little ranch sits right in the middle of what's now classified as a planned residential community. That makes it subject to our standards, whether you like it or not." I looked up from the papers to meet her gaze, and I saw something there that chilled me more than her legal threats. Genuine pleasure. She was enjoying this. The destruction of my family's legacy was entertainment to her, a sport where she held all the advantages, and I was nothing more than prey to be toyed with. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a well-rehearsed speech, "we have documented numerous violations of county health codes, noise ordinances, and environmental regulations. Your horses disturb the peace. Your cattle create unsightly and unsanitary conditions. And those helicopters—" She gestured vaguely at the sky where the military aircraft had disappeared. "The noise pollution alone is grounds for legal action." The irony of her words hit me like a physical blow. Those helicopters, the very aircraft she was complaining about, were the key to everything. But she didn't know that. None of them knew about the contract locked away in my barn office, the agreement that would turn their legal assault into a catastrophic miscalculation. "You have 30 days, Margaret said, turning to leave. "After that, we'll be forced to take more. Aggressive measures. I do hope you'll be reasonable about this, Mr. Harrison. Fighting us will only make things more expensive for you in the long run." She walked back to her pristine white sedan, parked just outside my gate like she owned the road itself. As she drove away, I noticed she made a point of going slowly, as if giving me time to absorb the full impact of what had just happened. I stood there long after her car disappeared around the bend, the legal papers hanging loose in my grip. The morning sun that had seemed so welcoming just minutes before now felt harsh and unforgiving. My horses whinnied softly from the pasture as if sensing the change in the air, the shift from peace to war that had come with the dawn. But as I folded the papers and walked back toward my house, something else stirred inside me. Not just anger, but determination. Margaret Penworth and her HOA cronies thought they had me cornered, thought they could steamroll over me like they had over so many others in their quest for suburban uniformity. They had no idea what they were really up against. The knock at my gate had awakened something that had been sleeping, the same stubborn defiance that had driven my grandfather to carve this ranch out of raw wilderness, the same fierce independence that had kept our family rooted to this land through droughts and floods, boom times and recessions. They wanted a war. They were about to get one. But first, I had some files to review and some phone calls to make. Because Margaret Penworth was right about one thing, this fight was going to be expensive, just not for the person she thought. The sound of helicopter blades echoed in my memory as I climbed the porch steps, and for the first time since opening that envelope, I allowed myself to smile. To understand what the Willowbrook Estates HOA was really trying to destroy, you'd have to go back to 1952, when my grandfather, Samuel Harrison, first laid eyes on this stretch of Texas prairie. He was 23 years old, fresh out of the Army, with nothing but a Purple Heart, a government loan, and a dream bigger than the endless sky that stretched above the grassland. I can still picture him the way my grandmother used to describe him, standing in the bed of his beat-up Ford pickup, squinting against the setting sun, his weathered hands shading his eyes as he surveyed what would become our family's legacy. The land wasn't much to look at then, just rolling hills covered in scrub brush and buffalo grass, with a creek that ran clean and cold through a stand of cottonwoods. But Grandpa Sam saw what it could become. "This is it, Betty," he'd told my grandmother, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that would define everything he built. "This is where we plant our roots." The early years were brutal. I've heard the stories so many times they feel like my own memories. How Grandpa worked construction during the day and built fence by moonlight. How he and Grandma lived in a one-room cabin he'd hammered together from salvaged lumber while he slowly constructed the house that still stands today. How they nearly lost everything during the drought of '56, when the creek ran dry and the cattle stood listless in whatever shade they could find. But they held on. They always held on. By the time my father, Robert Harrison, was old enough to walk, the ranch was starting to take shape. Grandpa had added a barn, expanded the house, and built up a herd of Black Angus that were the envy of the county. The smell of hay became the family perfume, the sound of boots on gravel our morning alarm clock, and the sight of endless horizons our daily blessing. I was born into this world in 1974, delivered by old Doc Peterson in the same bedroom where my father had drawn his first breath. My earliest memories are painted in the colors of this land, the rust-red dirt that stained my clothes, the golden waves of prairie grass that rippled in the wind, the deep blue of the sky that seemed to go on forever. I remember being 5 years old, riding on Grandpa Sam's shoulders as he walked the fence line, checking for breaks and teaching me the secrets of the land. "See that hawk up there, Jake?" he'd say, pointing to a redtail circling overhead. "He knows every inch of this prairie. That's how you got to know your land, like your own skin." By the time I was 10, I could ride as well as any grown man, could spot a sick calf from 100 yards away, and knew the difference between the sound of wind through healthy grass and wind through drought-stressed pasture. The ranch wasn't just where I lived, it was who I was. Dad carried on the tradition with the same quiet determination that had driven his father. He expanded our operation, added cutting horses to our breeding program, and always reminded me that we were stewards of something bigger than ourselves. "This land doesn't really belong to us, son," he told me one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the pasture. "We just get to take care of it for a while, pass it on to the next generation. That's the real responsibility, making sure it's better when we leave than when we found it." The irony wasn't lost on me, even then, that we were having this conversation while the suburbs crept closer each year. The Willowbrook Estates development had started as just a few houses on the eastern edge of our property line, but it grew like kudzu, spreading across what had once been the Martinez family's farm and the old Henderson place. At first, the new neighbors were mostly friendly, city folks who'd moved out to enjoy country living, but still appreciated having real ranchers nearby. Some of them even brought their kids over to see the horses, and I didn't mind answering questions about cattle or explaining why we got up before dawn every day. But as more houses went up and the development got its own fancy clubhouse and swimming pool, the dynamic began to change. The HOA formed in 2018, ostensibly to maintain property values and community standards. Margaret Penworth got herself elected president almost immediately, and that's when the trouble really started. It began small, complaints about the smell when we spread fertilizer, grumbling about the dust when we moved cattle along the county road that bordered their precious subdivision. Margaret started showing up at county commissioner meetings, advocating for stricter noise ordinances and environmental regulations that seemed tailored specifically to make ranch operations more difficult. The first formal complaint came in 2019, when she claimed our rooster was disturbing the peace. Never mind that the rooster had been crowing at dawn for 3 years before the first house in her development was even framed. According to Margaret, our failure to maintain reasonable noise levels was a violation of the county's newly updated residential zoning requirements. That's when I realized what was really happening. This wasn't about noise or dust or property values. This was about control. Margaret Penworth and her fellow HOA board members couldn't stand the fact that there was a piece of land in their perfect little world that they couldn't regulate, couldn't tame, couldn't force into their suburban mold. They looked at my ranch, with its weathered barns and working corrals, its horses and cattle and the controlled chaos that comes with any real agricultural operation. And they saw an affront to their vision of what a community should look like. They wanted everyone to have the same mailbox, the same landscaping, the same sanitized version of country living that came without any of the actual country. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that this land had been wild when their grandparents were still living in tenements back east. My family had earned the right to be here through decades of sweat and sacrifice, through seasons of plenty and years of drought, through the kind of deep commitment that couldn't be bought or sold or regulated out of existence. But there was something else they didn't know, something that would have made them think twice about their campaign against the Harrison Ranch if they'd bothered to do their research. In 2016, when the military base 20 miles south had needed additional space for training exercises, they'd approached me directly. Not the county, not the state, not the HOA, me. The conversation had been straightforward and respectful. The Army needed secure, private land for helicopter training and tactical exercises. They offered a long-term lease that would allow them to use the southern quarter of my property for these operations while leaving the rest of the ranch completely undisturbed. The money was good, better than good, actually. But that wasn't what sold me on the deal. What mattered was that the military understood something that Margaret Penworth and her HOA never would: the value of working land, the importance of preserving spaces where people could still make their living from the soil and the seasons. The contract was ironclad, written by military lawyers who understood the complexities of federal jurisdiction and land use. It specified that any interference with the lease or the property itself would constitute obstruction of federal operations, a serious offense that carried serious consequences. As I stood in my kitchen that morning, reading Margaret's ultimatum for the third time, I felt the weight of all that history pressing down on me. 3 generations of Harrisons had called this land home. We'd weathered the Great Depression, 2 recessions, countless droughts, and every challenge that rural life could throw at us. We sure as hell weren't going to be defeated by a suburban homeowners association. The morning light slanted through my kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Outside, I could hear my horses nickering softly as they waited for their morning feed, the sound as familiar and comforting as my own heartbeat. Margaret Penworth thought she knew what she was up against. She thought she was dealing with just another stubborn old rancher who would eventually buckle under legal pressure and bureaucratic harassment. She had no idea she was about to go to war with the United States military. Harassment began 3 days after Margaret Penworth's visit, like clockwork precision in its calculated cruelty. I woke to find a bright orange citation zip-tied to my front gate, accusing me of violating County Ordinance 47B. Failure to maintain adequate setbacks from residential property lines. The fine was $250, and according to the fine print, it would double every week until corrected. The absurdity of it hit me like a slap in the face. The fence they were citing had been standing in the exact same spot since 1967. I had the original survey markers to prove it, but apparently the HOA had convinced some clerk in the county office that my property line was somehow encroaching on their precious development. I crumpled the citation and tossed it in my truck, making a mental note to visit the county office later. But as I walked out to feed the horses that morning, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt along my fence line, tracks that hadn't been there the night before. Someone had been driving around my property in the dark. The violations came daily after that, each one more ridiculous than the last. I was cited for excessive dust generation during normal cattle operations. I received a warning for improper disposal of organic waste because of the manure pile behind my barn, the same pile that had been in the same location for 15 years, the same pile that I used to fertilize the very pastures that kept my operation sustainable. They fined me for unlicensed commercial vehicle storage because my cattle trailer was visible from the road. Never mind that it was parked on my own property, behind my own barn, exactly where farm equipment belonged. But the citations were just the opening salvo. The real harassment was more insidious, more personal. I started noticing cars parked along the county road at odd hours, always with someone in the driver's seat holding what looked like a camera or phone. When I'd walk out to investigate, they'd drive away quickly, but not before I caught glimpses of faces I recognized from HOA meetings. Margaret's little army of suburban soldiers, documenting every aspect of my daily routine like I was some kind of criminal under surveillance. The phone calls started around the same time. Not threatening calls, Margaret was too smart for that, but anonymous tips to various county offices. Someone reported that I was running an illegal boarding facility because I occasionally helped train horses for neighbors. Another call claimed I was operating a commercial waste facility because of my compost operation. Each call meant inspections, paperwork. Hours of my time wasted explaining to county employees that I was running a legitimate agricultural operation exactly the way my family had for decades. Most of the inspectors were apologetic, clearly recognizing the harassment for what it was, but they still had to follow up on every complaint. The worst part was the night photography. I'd catch glimpses of camera flashes in the darkness, brief bursts of light that illuminated nothing but left me feeling exposed and violated. They were documenting everything: my work schedule, my vehicle movements, even when I turned lights on and off in my house. I found footprints in my vegetable garden one morning, footprints that definitely didn't belong to me or any of my ranch hands. Someone had been creeping around my house in the dark, close enough to peer through windows, close enough to violate the most basic human expectation of privacy and security. The stress began to seep into everything. My horses grew skittish, sensing my tension and reacting to every unexpected sound with nervous energy. My cattle clustered closer to the barn than usual, as if they too could feel the hostile eyes watching from the suburban fortress next door. I started losing sleep, lying awake at night, listening for the sound of car engines or footsteps, my body coiled with the constant expectation of another violation, another intrusion, another assault on the peace that had defined this place for my entire life. But Margaret Penworth wasn't content with petty harassment and surveillance. She was building toward something bigger, something that would require the full cooperation of the local government. And that's when I discovered just how deep her influence really ran. I learned about it by accident, overhearing a conversation at Murphy's feed store between two county employees who didn't realize I was within earshot. They were discussing a special zoning review that was scheduled for my property, a formal evaluation of whether my agricultural designation should be revoked. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. An agricultural designation wasn't just a tax classification, it was the legal foundation that allowed me to operate as a ranch. Without it, I'd be subject to residential zoning requirements that would make continuing my operation impossible. No livestock, no agricultural buildings, no equipment storage. In one bureaucratic stroke, they could legislate my family's legacy out of existence. I drove straight to the county planning office, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The clerk behind the counter was helpful but nervous, clearly uncomfortable with what she was telling me. "Yes, Mr. Harrison, there is a formal review scheduled for your property," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "We received several petitions from concerned citizens regarding compatibility issues with the surrounding residential development." She handed me a thick folder of documents, and as I flipped through them, I felt like I was looking at the evidence file for my own execution. Petition after petition, all bearing signatures from Willowbrook Estates residents, all claiming that my ranch posed a threat to their health, safety, and property values. The language was clearly coached, probably written by the same lawyer who'd drafted Margaret's violation notices. Every petition hit the same talking points: noise pollution, dust contamination, traffic hazards, environmental concerns. They'd even included photographs, carefully angled shots that made my well-maintained facilities look run down and dangerous. But the most chilling document was a formal letter from Margaret Penworth herself, written on official HOA letterhead and addressed to the county commissioners. In it, she laid out what she called a comprehensive solution to the agricultural incompatibility problem. She proposed that the county revoke my agricultural designation and require me to either convert my property to residential use or sell it to developers who would integrate it appropriately into the existing community structure. She even had the audacity to suggest that this would be beneficial for all parties since I could profit from the increased property values that residential development would bring. Reading those words felt like watching someone plan the murder of everything I'd ever loved. She wasn't just trying to shut down my ranch, she was trying to erase it entirely, to turn 70 years of Harrison family history into another collection of cookie-cutter houses with perfect lawns and 3-car garages. The review was scheduled for 6 weeks away, which meant I had 6 weeks to prepare a defense against an attack that had been months in the making. 6 weeks to fight for the survival of my family's legacy against opponents who had money, political connections, and the righteous fury of people who believed they were protecting their investment. I drove home that evening in a fog of rage and desperation, my mind racing through possible strategies and legal defenses. The sun was setting behind the cottonwoods, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that had comforted me my entire life. But tonight, even that beauty felt fragile, threatened by forces that wanted to pave over everything wild and authentic in favor of suburban uniformity. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a new addition to the surveillance routine: a white SUV parked just outside my property line, positioned for a clear view of my house and barn. In the driver's seat, I could make out a figure with what looked like a telephoto camera lens. I sat in my truck for a long moment, staring at that vehicle and feeling the weight of everything that was at stake. This wasn't just about zoning laws or property values. This was about the right to live according to your own values, to maintain a way of life that honored the past while building toward the future. Margaret Penworth and her HOA thought they could bully me into submission, thought they could use bureaucracy and harassment to drive me from land that had been in my family for 70 years. They thought they understood the rules of this game better than some simple rancher who'd never learned to navigate the complexities of suburban politics. What they didn't understand was that I had allies they'd never considered, resources they didn't know existed, and a trump card that would turn their carefully orchestrated campaign into the kind of spectacular miscalculation that ends political careers and destroys reputations. But I wasn't ready to play that card yet. Let them think they were winning. Let them get overconfident and sloppy. Let them dig their hole a little deeper before I buried them in it. The white SUV started its engine and drove away as darkness fell over my ranch. But I knew it would be back tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day until this war reached its inevitable conclusion. I walked into my house, poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon, and started planning my counterattack. The barn office hadn't seen a thorough cleaning since my father's death 5 years ago, and as I stood in the doorway that morning, breathing in the musty scent of old paper and leather, I felt the weight of procrastination settling on my shoulders like a guilty conscience. Coffee mug in hand, I surveyed the chaos that had accumulated over decades of ranch management. Filing cabinets stuffed with veterinary records, tax documents and equipment warranties, boxes of photographs documenting cattle sales and horse shows, and enough agricultural magazines to build a small fort. Somewhere in this maze of paperwork was the ammunition I needed to fight the HOA's zoning review. I had to find every document that proved the legitimacy of my agricultural operation, every piece of evidence that demonstrated the ranch's historical and economic importance. But as I pulled open the first filing cabinet drawer, my hands already dusty from disturbed papers, I wondered if I was looking for weapons in a gunfight when my enemies were wielding nuclear warheads. The morning sun slanted through the barn's single window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits of all the work that had been done in this space. My grandfather had built this office in the 1960s, a simple addition to the barn where he could keep records and conduct the business side of ranching away from the chaos of daily operations. Dad had expanded it in the 1980s, adding more filing space and a small desk where he'd sit every evening, updating ledgers and planning the next day's work. Now it was my turn to continue that legacy, assuming I could find the documents that would keep Margaret Penworth from legislating it out of existence. I started with the oldest files, working my way through decades of carefully maintained records. Here was the original deed from 1952, Grandpa's signature still bold and confident despite being nearly 70 years old. Here were the first cattle purchase records, documenting the acquisition of the Black Angus herd that had formed the foundation of our operation. Tax records, insurance policies, veterinary reports, the entire financial and legal history of the Harrison Ranch, meticulously preserved by 3 generations of men who understood that paperwork was just as important as pasture management. But it was in the third filing cabinet, wedged between a folder of horse registration papers and a thick envelope of county correspondence, that I found something that made my heart stop. The folder was labeled Federal Contracts, 2016, in my own handwriting, but somehow I'd forgotten about it in the chaos of the past few weeks. As I pulled it from the drawer, it felt heavier than it should have, weighted with implications I hadn't considered. When I'd first filed it away, inside was the complete documentation of my agreement with the United States Army, not just the basic lease agreement I'd remembered, but the full legal framework that governed every aspect of their use of my property. As I spread the documents across my father's old desk, the magnitude of what I was looking at began to sink in. This wasn't just a simple land lease. This was a comprehensive federal contract that designated my ranch as an official tactical training area under the jurisdiction of the Department of Defense. The language was dense and technical, filled with military jargon and legal terminology that had seemed routine when I'd first signed it. But reading it now, with the HOA's ultimatum fresh in my mind, I realized I was holding something that could change everything. The contract was ironclad in ways I hadn't fully appreciated. It granted the military exclusive use of 640 acres of my southern pasture for helicopter training, tactical exercises, and equipment testing. But more importantly, it established federal jurisdiction over those activities and anything that might interfere with them. Section 12 was particularly interesting. The contractor agrees to maintain unrestricted access to the designated training area and to protect the integrity of federal operations from interference by local authorities, civilian organizations, or private individuals. Any attempt to impede, restrict, or otherwise interfere with activities conducted under this agreement shall be reported immediately to the Department of Defense and may result in federal prosecution under applicable statutes. I read that section 3 times, my pulse quickening with each repetition. The military wasn't just renting my land, they were asserting federal authority over it, and that authority superseded any local zoning laws, HOA regulations, or county ordinances that might interfere with their operations. But the real bombshell was in the appendices, where the contract spelled out exactly what kinds of interference were prohibited. The language was broad and comprehensive, covering everything from physical obstruction of military activities to legal challenges that might restrict access to the training area. According to Section 18C, Any attempt to force changes in land use, zoning classification, or operational parameters of the host property could be considered indirect interference with federal operations and subject to the same penalties as direct obstruction. In other words, Margaret Penworth's campaign to shut down my ranch wasn't just harassment, it was potentially a federal crime. My hands were shaking slightly as I flipped through the rest of the documents, finding detail after detail that made the HOA's position more precarious. The contract required me to maintain the ranch as a working agricultural operation, both to provide cover for military activities and to preserve the rural character that made the training exercises realistic. Any forced conversion to residential use would violate the federal agreement and could result in breach of contract penalties that would bankrupt the county. Even better, the contract included a clause requiring the military to defend the integrity of the training facility against external threats. If the HOA's zoning review threatened the military's ability to use my land, the Department of Defense was legally obligated to intervene. I sat back in my father's chair. The contract spread out before me like a roadmap to victory. All this time, while Margaret Penworth had been orchestrating her campaign of harassment and bureaucratic warfare, I'd had the ultimate trump card sitting in a filing cabinet, gathering dust. The irony was almost too perfect. The same helicopters that Margaret complained about in her violation notices were the key to her defeat. The military operations she wanted to stop were protected by federal law that made her entire campaign not just futile, but potentially criminal. But as the initial rush of relief faded, I realized I had a choice to make. I could play this card immediately, contact the military liaison, and let them know about the HOA's activities. That would probably end Margaret's campaign overnight, but it would also end any possibility of teaching her the kind of lesson that would stick. Or I could wait. Let her dig herself deeper. Let her commit more resources to a battle she'd already lost. Let her make more enemies and burn more bridges in pursuit of a victory that was legally impossible. The second option was riskier. There was always a chance that the zoning review could go badly, that some bureaucrat might make a decision that would be expensive and time-consuming to reverse, even with federal protection. But it was also more satisfying. Margaret Penworth had declared war on my family's legacy, had tried to destroy something that took 70 years to build. She deserved to learn the consequences of that kind of arrogance. I carefully placed the contract documents back in their folder, but this time I put them in my desk drawer where I could access them quickly. Then I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Captain Sarah Martinez, the military liaison who managed the training contract. I didn't call her. Not yet. But I wanted to have the number ready when the time came. The sound that had started this whole mess, the distant thrum of helicopter, blades, drifted through the barn, window as another training flight passed overhead. But now, instead of being a source of irritation for the HOA, it was the sound of my salvation. Margaret Penworth thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers. What she didn't realize was that I'd been playing an entirely different game all along, one where the rules were written by people with more power than any suburban homeowners association could ever dream of wielding. I finished my coffee and headed back to the house, leaving the contract safely locked in my desk drawer. There would be time to deploy that weapon later. For now, I had a zoning review to prepare for, and I wanted to make sure Margaret's victory seemed as certain as possible before I pulled the rug out from under her. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, and somewhere in her climate-controlled office in the Willowbrook Estates clubhouse, Margaret Penworth was probably planning her next move in what she believed was a war she was winning. She had no idea that she'd already lost. The news of the special community meeting arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the kind of cheerful malice that only Margaret Penworth could muster. The hand-delivered flyer announced that the Willowbrook Estates HOA would be hosting an emergency community forum to discuss ongoing agricultural incompatibility issues that were affecting property values and quality of life. Translation: they were gathering. The lynch mob. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the clubhouse, and according to the flyer, all concerned residents are encouraged to attend and voice their support for immediate resolution of these critical community issues. They weren't even pretending to be neutral anymore. This was going to be a public execution, orchestrated for maximum humiliation. I sat on my porch that evening, reading the flyer for the third time while my coffee grew cold in my hands. The sun was setting behind the cottonwoods, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that had comforted me my entire life. But tonight, even that beauty felt fragile, threatened by forces that wanted to turn my family's legacy into a cautionary tale about standing up to progress. That's when I heard the crunch of gravel in my driveway and looked up to see Tom Rodriguez climbing out of his pickup truck. Tom owned the feed store in town and had been supplying my family with everything from cattle feed to horse medicine for the past 20 years. More importantly, he was one of the few people in the county who remembered what things were like before the suburban invasion. "Evening. Jake," he said, settling into the rocking chair beside mine with the easy familiarity of an old friend. "Heard about your troubles with the HOA. I handed him the flyer, and he read it while shaking his head slowly. "They're really going all out, aren't they? Emergency Community Forum. Makes it sound like you're running a chemical plant instead of raising cattle." "They've got it all planned out," I said, taking a sip of my cold coffee and grimacing. "Gather the whole neighborhood. Let everyone air their grievances, then present their final ultimatum with the full weight of public opinion behind it." Tom folded the flyer and handed it back to me. "You know, Jake, you're not as alone in this as you might think. There's plenty of folks around here who are getting tired of Margaret Penworth and her little empire. She's been throwing her weight around for too long, stepping on too many toes. That got my attention." "What do you mean?" "Well, take old Mrs. Garcia, for instance. Lives in that little house on Maple Street. Been there since before the development was even built. Margaret's been trying to force her to repaint her house and redo her landscaping, claiming it doesn't meet community standards. Never mind that Mrs. Garcia's house predates the HOA by 15 years. Tom leaned forward in his chair, warming to his subject. "And then there's the Johnsons. They wanted to put in a vegetable garden, but Margaret said it violated the covenant about appropriate landscaping. Bob Johnson fought her on it for 6 months before he finally gave up and planted grass instead." As Tom talked, I began to understand that Margaret's war against my ranch was just the latest campaign in a broader conquest. She'd been systematically intimidating and controlling everyone within her reach, using the HOA as a weapon to enforce her vision of suburban perfection. "The thing is," Tom continued, "most folks just roll over and take it. They figure it's easier to go along than to fight. But watching her go after your ranch, trying to destroy something that's been here longer than most of their grandparents, that's different. That's crossing a line." Over the next few days, word spread through the county's informal network of coffee shops, feed stores, and church social halls. People started stopping by the ranch, ostensibly to buy hay or ask about horse training, but really to express their support and share their own stories of HOA overreach. Maria Santos, who cleaned houses in Willowbrook Estates, told me about overhearing Margaret's strategy sessions in her own kitchen. "She's got it all planned out," Maria whispered as we stood beside my horse corral. "She's going to pack that meeting with her supporters, make it look like the whole community is against you. Then she's going to demand that the county commissioners attend the next zoning review as representatives of community concerns." Even more valuable was the information I got from Billy Chen, whose construction company had done work throughout the development. "You want to know something interesting?" he said, leaning against his truck while we talked. "Margaret's been talking to developers about your land. Word is, she's already got preliminary plans drawn up for a luxury subdivision to be built right where your ranch sits now. That revelation hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about community standards or property values. Margaret was orchestrating the destruction of my ranch so she could profit from its corpse. But the most important conversation happened late Wednesday evening, when I finally called Captain Sarah Martinez at the Military Liaison Office. I'd been putting off that call, wanting to time it perfectly. But with the community meeting less than 24 hours away, I couldn't wait any longer. "Captain Martinez," I said when she answered her direct line, "this is Jake Harrison. I lease land to you folks for the helicopter training program." "Of course, Mr. Harrison. Good to hear from you. I hope there's no problem with the lease arrangements." "Actually, there might be. I'm facing some local pressure that could interfere with your operations. A homeowners association is trying to force changes to my property that would make it impossible for me to continue the lease." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Captain Martinez spoke again, her voice had taken on a much more serious tone. "Mr. Harrison, any interference with our training operations is a matter of national security. Can you give me more details about what kind of pressure you're facing?" I spent the next 20 minutes walking her through the entire situation. The violation notices, the harassment, the zoning review, and Thursday's community meeting. Captain Martinez listened without interruption, but I could hear her typing notes on her computer. "This is very concerning," she said when I finished. "Our contract with you specifically requires that the training facility remain operational and accessible. If local authorities are trying to force changes that would interfere with that, we need to take immediate action." "I was hoping you might say that," I said, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders for the first time in weeks. "Mr. Harrison, I'm going to need you to document everything. Every violation notice, every harassment incident, every attempt to interfere with your operation. And I want you to keep me informed about this community meeting tomorrow night. Depending on what happens there, we may need to make our federal interest in this matter very clear to the local authorities." "Understood, Captain. I'll keep detailed records of everything. One more thing, Mr. Harrison. I want you to know that the Department of Defense takes these lease agreements very seriously. We've invested significant resources in establishing this training facility, and we're not going to let local politics interfere with national security operations." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone and feeling like I'd just activated a nuclear weapon. Captain Martinez had been professional and measured in her response, but there was no mistaking the iron beneath her polite words. The United States military was now officially interested in Margaret Penworth's little war, and that changed everything. But I still wasn't ready to deploy that weapon. Tomorrow night's meeting would be my chance to let Margaret and her supporters commit themselves fully to their chosen course of action. I wanted them to go on record with their demands, to make public statements that they couldn't later deny or walk back. I wanted them to hang themselves with their own rope before I cut them down. Thursday evening arrived, with the kind of oppressive humidity that promised storms later in the night. As I drove toward the Willowbrook Estates clubhouse, I could see lights blazing in the windows and cars packed into every available parking space. Margaret had succeeded in drawing a crowd. I parked at the back of the lot and sat in my truck for a moment, gathering my thoughts. In my jacket pocket was a copy of the military lease agreement, along with Captain Martinez's direct phone number. But I also had something else, a small digital voice recorder that would capture every word of tonight's proceedings. As I walked toward the clubhouse entrance, I could hear the buzz of conversation from inside, the excited chatter of people who believed they were about to witness the final victory in a long campaign. Through the windows, I could see Margaret Penworth at the front of the room, gesturing animatedly as she spoke to a group of supporters. She looked confident, triumphant even. She had no idea that she was about to make the biggest mistake of her political career. I took a deep breath, checked that my recorder was working, and stepped through the doors into what Margaret believed would be my public execution. Instead, It was going to be her political suicide. The Willowbrook Estates clubhouse had been transformed into a coliseum, complete with an audience hungry for blood. As I stepped through the glass doors, the buzz of conversation hit me like a wave. Dozens of voices all talking at once about property values, community standards, and the problem that needed to be solved. The room was packed beyond its normal capacity, with folding chairs set up in additional rows and people standing along the walls. Margaret Penworth had positioned herself at the front of the room behind a borrowed podium, flanked by the rest of the HOA board like generals preparing for war. She'd even managed to set up a projection screen, which currently displayed a slide titled, "Protecting Our Community, the Willowbrook Way." Her silver hair was pulled back in its usual severe bun, but tonight she wore a navy blue blazer that gave her the appearance of someone running for political office. Which in a way she was. This wasn't just about my ranch anymore. This was about establishing Margaret as the undisputed queen of suburban conformity, the woman who could take on any threat to the ordered perfection of their artificial paradise. I made my way toward an empty chair near the back, nodding to the few faces I recognized. Most of the audience were Willowbrook Estates residents I'd never met, but there were also several county employees who'd clearly been invited to witness Margaret's triumph. I even spotted County Commissioner Williams in the third row, looking uncomfortable but politically obligated to attend. As I settled into my seat, I noticed Tom Rodriguez and a few other local business owners scattered throughout the crowd. They caught my eye and gave subtle nods of support, but they were vastly outnumbered by Margaret's suburban army. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, her voice amplified by a wireless microphone that gave her words an appropriately theatrical quality. "Thank you all for coming out tonight to address a serious threat to our community's well-being and property values." She clicked to the next slide, which showed an aerial photograph of my ranch clearly taken from one of those surveillance flights. My property looked isolated and out of place, surrounded by the geometric precision of the development's manicured lawns and identical houses. "For too long," Margaret continued, "we've tolerated an incompatible land use that creates noise pollution, environmental hazards, and traffic problems right in the heart of our residential community. Tonight, we're going to take action to protect the investment we've all made in the Willowbrook way of life." The crowd murmured its approval, and I could see several people taking photos with their phones, documenting what they clearly expected to be a historic moment. Margaret clicked through a series of slides that painted my ranch as everything short of a toxic waste dump. There were carefully angled photographs that made my barn look dilapidated, my equipment appear rusty and dangerous, and my cattle seemed diseased and neglected. She'd even included recordings of helicopter noise, which she played at dramatically increased volume to demonstrate the unbearable sound pollution that my military lease supposedly created. "The health and safety impacts are undeniable," she declared, gesturing toward a slide filled with pseudo-scientific claims about dust contamination and groundwater pollution. "But the economic impact is even more severe. Independent appraisals show that the presence of this agricultural operation has depressed property values throughout our development by an average of 15%. I almost laughed out loud at that one. The independent appraisal was clearly something she'd commissioned specifically for this presentation, probably from an appraiser who'd never set foot on my property. But the crowd was eating it up. I could see heads nodding throughout the room, faces growing more determined as Margaret built her case for my destruction. "Now," she said, clicking to a slide titled Community Action Plan, "we come to the reason for tonight's meeting. The county has scheduled a zoning review for the Harrison property, and we need to make sure our voices are heard loud and clear." She outlined their strategy with military precision. They would attend the zoning review en masse, presenting a united front of concerned citizens. They would submit formal petitions demanding the revocation of my agricultural designation. and they would make it clear to the county commissioners that their political futures depended on taking action against my ranch. But we're not just going to complain, Margaret announced with the satisfied smile of someone revealing their trump card. We're also going to present a solution. I've been working with Pinnacle Development Corporation to create a preliminary plan for converting the Harrison property into a luxury residential community that would be fully compatible with our existing neighborhood. The slide changed to show an artist's rendering of my ranch transformed into another suburban development, complete with curved streets, identical houses, and a golf course where my cattle currently grazed. The audience broke into spontaneous applause. That's when I felt my hand move to the digital recorder in my jacket pocket, making sure it was capturing every word of Margaret's confession. She wasn't just trying to shut down my ranch, she was actively conspiring with developers to profit from its destruction. The economic benefits would be enormous, she continued, warming to her favorite subject. Property values throughout Willowbrook Estates would increase by an estimated 20 to 30%. The county would benefit from increased tax revenue, and most importantly, we would finally have the cohesive, well-planned community that we all moved here to enjoy. Margaret opened the floor to comments, and for the next 30 minutes, I sat through a parade of suburban grievances that would have been comical if they weren't so personally destructive. Mrs. Henderson complained that the smell of hay made her allergic. Mr. Peterson claimed that my cattle were attracting flies that were somehow migrating to his backyard barbecues. Several people expressed concern that my ranch was bringing down the tone of their neighborhood. But the most damaging testimony came from people who'd clearly been coached by Margaret. They spoke in official-sounding language about environmental impact and public safety concerns, using phrases that would carry weight in a formal zoning review. Through it all, I sat quietly in my chair, letting them dig their hole deeper and deeper. Every complaint, every demand, every threat was being recorded for posterity. When this was all over, I'd have a complete audio record of their coordinated campaign to destroy my family's legacy. Finally, Margaret called for a formal vote on a resolution demanding that the county revoke my agricultural designation and force the sale of my property for residential development. The vote was unanimous among the HOA members present, with only Tom Rodriguez and a few other non-residents abstaining. "Mr. Harrison," Margaret said, turning her attention to me for the first time all evening, "I see you've honored us with your presence tonight. Would you like to make a statement before we adjourn?" The room fell silent, every eye turning toward me. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for. My public capitulation. My acknowledgement that their suburban empire was more powerful than my family's 70-year legacy. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 3 generations pressing down on my shoulders. When I spoke, my voice was calm and steady, betraying none of the rage or satisfaction that was building inside me. "Thank you, Margaret. I appreciate the opportunity to address your concerns." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. "I want you all to know that I've listened carefully to everything that's been said tonight. I understand that you feel strongly about this issue, and I respect your right to express your opinions." More silence. Margaret was beginning to look suspicious, clearly wondering why I wasn't fighting back or defending my position. "I also want you to know that I take my responsibilities as a neighbor very seriously. If there are legitimate concerns about my operation, I'm always willing to discuss them in good faith." I reached into my jacket pocket, and for a moment, Margaret's eyes widened as if she expected me to pull out some kind of weapon. Instead, I retrieved a single sheet of paper. Not the military contract, but a simple business card. That's why I'd like to invite anyone who's interested to contact my lawyer, David Chen, who specializes in agricultural law and federal regulations. I think you'll find that there are some aspects of this situation that haven't been fully considered. I placed the business card on the registration table at the back of the room, where anyone could pick it up. Several people looked confused, clearly expecting more drama from this confrontation. "Margaret," I said, turning back to face her directly, "I want to thank you for organizing tonight's meeting. It's been very educational for everyone involved. I think we all have a much clearer understanding of where we stand." The room was completely silent now, the audience clearly baffled by my calm response to their coordinated attack. "I look forward to seeing you at the county zoning review," I continued. "I think that meeting is going to be very interesting indeed." And with that, I walked toward the exit, nodding politely to the people I passed. Behind me, I could hear the confused murmur of voices trying to make sense of what had just happened. They'd expected a broken man begging for mercy, and instead, they'd gotten someone who seemed almost amused by their efforts. As I reached the door, I heard Margaret's voice behind me, raised to address the room. "Well, I think Mr. Harrison's response speaks for itself. Clearly, he has no intention of being reasonable about this matter. That makes our course of action even more necessary." I smiled as I stepped out into the humid night air. Margaret was absolutely right about one thing. The county zoning review was going to be very interesting indeed, but not for the reasons she thought. As I walked back to my truck, I could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon, and I could hear the distant rumble of thunder mixing with something else. The familiar thump, thump, thump of helicopter blades cutting through the night air. Another training exercise was beginning, and soon Margaret Penworth was going to discover that some battles can't be won with suburban politics and developer connections. Some battles require bigger guns than a homeowners association could ever hope to deploy. The county zoning review was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. But by 1:30, the conference room at the county courthouse was already packed beyond capacity. Margaret Penworth had arrived early with what looked like half the population of Willowbrook Estates, their faces bearing the confident expressions of people who believed they were about to witness the final victory in a long campaign. I sat in the back row, a manila folder on my lap containing documents that would change everything. But I wasn't alone this time. Tom Rodriguez sat beside me, along with Maria Santos and several other local business owners who'd grown tired of HOA overreach. More importantly, Captain Sarah Martinez sat in the row behind me, wearing civilian clothes but carrying herself with the unmistakable bearing of a military officer. She'd arrived in town that morning, ostensibly to conduct a routine inspection of the training facility Lease. But her real purpose was to observe the proceedings and, if necessary, make the federal government's position very clear to the county commissioners. Commissioner Williams called the meeting to order at exactly 2 p.m., his normally jovial demeanor replaced by the careful neutrality of a politician who sensed he was walking into a minefield. "We're here today to review the agricultural designation of the Harrison Ranch property," he announced, reading from prepared remarks. This review was requested by concerned citizens who believe that the current land use may not be compatible with the surrounding residential development. Margaret practically bounced out of her chair when given the floor, her silver hair gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. She'd prepared another presentation, complete with slides and charts, but this time her audience included 3 county commissioners who had the actual power to make decisions. "Commissioners," she began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. "The evidence we're about to present demonstrates beyond any doubt that the Harrison Ranch represents a clear and present danger to public health, safety, and economic welfare." For the next 20 minutes, she reprised her greatest hits from the community meeting. The noise complaints, the environmental concerns, the property value impacts, but this time she'd added new elements specifically designed to sway government officials. References to county liability, potential lawsuits from affected residents, and the political consequences of ignoring community concerns. She even brought witnesses. Mrs. Henderson testified about her allergies, Mr. Peterson described the fly problem, and several other residents shared carefully rehearsed stories about how my ranch was ruining their quality of life. But the most damaging testimony came from Dr. Richard Klein, who identified himself as an environmental consultant hired by the HOA to assess the impact of agricultural operations on residential communities. The dust particulates generated by cattle operations, he said, consulting a thick report, contain numerous allergens and potential pathogens that pose serious health risks to nearby residents. The noise pollution from both livestock and associated helicopter activity exceeds EPA guidelines for residential areas, and the runoff from animal waste represents a significant threat to groundwater quality. It was impressive testimony, delivered with scientific authority and backed by official-looking charts and graphs. The only problem was that it was complete fiction, based on assumptions and extrapolations rather than actual testing of my property. Commissioner Williams looked genuinely concerned as he reviewed Dr. Klein's report. "Mr. Harrison," he said, turning toward me, "how do you respond to these environmental and health concerns?" I stood slowly, the manila folder still in my hands. This was the moment I'd been planning for, the culmination of weeks of careful strategy. But as I looked around the room at Margaret's smug smile and the expectant faces of the HOA supporters, I realized I wanted to savor this moment just a little longer. "Commissioner Williams," I said, "I appreciate the opportunity to address these concerns, and I want to thank Mrs. Penworth and her supporters for bringing their issues to your attention in such a comprehensive manner." Margaret's smile widened, clearly interpreting my polite tone as surrender. "However," I continued, "I think there may be some factors in this situation that haven't been fully considered. Factors that could significantly impact the county's decision-making authority in this matter." I opened the manila folder and removed a single document, the signature page of the military lease agreement, with the official seals and federal contract numbers clearly visible. You see, Commissioners, my ranch isn't just a private agricultural operation, it's also a designated federal training facility under contract with the United States Army. The room went completely silent. Margaret's smile froze on her face like a mask that had suddenly stopped fitting properly. "This contract," I continued, holding up the document so everyone could see the official seals, "grants the federal government exclusive training rights on 640 acres of my property. It also establishes federal jurisdiction over any activities that might interfere with those training operations." Commissioner Williams leaned forward in his chair, his political instincts clearly screaming that he'd walked into something much bigger than a simple zoning dispute. "Mr. Harrison," he said carefully, "are you saying that your property falls under federal jurisdiction?" "I'm saying that any attempt to change the operational parameters of my ranch, including its zoning classification, would constitute interference with federal military operations, and that such interference could result in some very serious legal consequences." That's when we heard it, the distant thump, thump, thump of helicopter blades cutting through the afternoon air. At first, it was just a whisper of sound, barely audible over the courthouse's air conditioning system, but it grew steadily louder until the windows began to vibrate with the bass percussion of multiple aircraft approaching. Margaret turned toward the windows, her face pale and confused. "What is that?" I checked my watch. "That would be the 2:30 training exercise. They're right on schedule." The sound grew louder, and through the conference room windows, we could see them, 3 military helicopters in formation, flying low over the courthouse before banking toward my ranch. The roar of their engines was deafening, drowning out all conversation for nearly a minute. As the sound faded, I turned back to the commissioners. "As you can see, the federal government takes these training operations very seriously. They've invested significant resources in establishing this facility, and they're not going to let local politics interfere with national security requirements." Commissioner Williams was frantically flipping through the papers in front of him, clearly looking for any reference to federal involvement in the zoning review. Mr. Harrison, when you submitted your response to the review request, why didn't you mention this federal contract? Because I was curious to see how far Mrs. Penworth and her supporters were willing to go in their campaign against my property. I wanted to give them every opportunity to fully commit to their chosen course of action. I turned to look directly at Margaret, who was staring at me with the expression of someone who just realized they'd been playing poker with a man who'd been holding 5 aces all along. You see, Commissioners, Mrs. Penworth has accused me of violating county ordinances, creating environmental hazards, and threatening public safety. But what she's actually done is organize a coordinated campaign to interfere with federal military operations. And that's not just a civil matter. It's a potential federal crime. The room erupted in confused murmurs, but Margaret's voice cut through the noise like a blade. This is ridiculous. Some lease agreement doesn't give you the right to ignore county zoning laws. Actually, said a new voice from the back of the room, it does exactly that. Every head in the room turned to see Captain Martinez standing up, her military bearing now impossible to disguise despite her civilian clothes. I'm Captain Sarah Martinez with the Army's Installation Management Command, she announced, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. I manage the training facility lease with Mr. Harrison, and I'm here to inform this Commission that any action taken against the Harrison property would constitute direct interference with federal operations. Commissioner Williams looked like he was about to have a heart attack. Captain, we had no idea that federal interests were involved in this matter. That's because Mr. Harrison chose not to mention it initially, Captain Martinez replied, moving toward the front of the room with predatory grace. But given the nature of the accusations being made here today, I felt it was important to clarify the federal government's position. She placed a thick folder on the commissioner's table. This contains the complete documentation of our lease agreement with Mr. Harrison, along with relevant federal statutes governing interference with military operations. I think you'll find that the county has no authority to modify the zoning classification of a designated federal training facility. Margaret was on her feet now, her face flushed with anger and desperation. This is a setup. He planned this whole thing. Actually, Mrs. Penworth, I said, pulling out my digital recorder and placing it on the table. You planned this whole thing. I just documented it. I pressed play, and Margaret's voice filled the room. I've been working with Pinnacle Development Corporation to create a preliminary plan for converting the Harrison property into a luxury residential community. The audio continued for several minutes, capturing her admission that she was conspiring with developers to profit from my property, her coordination of harassment campaigns, and her explicit threats to destroy my ranch through bureaucratic warfare. By the time the recording ended, Margaret looked like she was about to collapse. Several of her supporters were staring at her with expressions of betrayal and disgust, clearly realizing they'd been manipulated into supporting someone else's profit scheme. Commissioner Williams cleared his throat. In light of these new developments, I think it's clear that this zoning review cannot proceed as planned. The county obviously needs to consult with federal authorities before making any decisions that might affect military operations. That won't be necessary, Captain Martinez said smoothly. The federal position is very clear. Any attempt to modify the operational parameters of this training facility would be considered interference with national security. The Department of Defense would be forced to take appropriate action to protect our interests. She didn't specify what appropriate action might entail, but her tone left no doubt that it would be something Margaret's suburban empire couldn't survive. The meeting ended in chaos, with Margaret's supporters fleeing the room like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Several people stopped to apologize to me on their way out, claiming they'd been misled about the true nature of the situation. Margaret herself sat frozen in her chair, staring at the federal documents spread across the commissioner's table like they were evidence of her own execution. As I packed up my materials and prepared to leave, Commissioner Williams approached me with the careful deference of a politician who'd just learned he'd almost made a career-ending mistake. "Mr. Harrison," he said quietly, "I want to assure you that the county has no intention of interfering with federal operations. This whole review was based on incomplete information." "I understand, Commissioner. No hard feelings. I do have one question, though. Why didn't you just tell us about the federal contract from the beginning? It would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." I looked back at Margaret, who was still sitting in her chair like a broken marionette, and then at the empty seats where her supporters had been just minutes before. "Because sometimes, Commissioner, people need to learn that there are consequences for trying to destroy something that took 70 years to build. And sometimes, the best way to teach that lesson is to let them think they're winning right up until the moment they discover they've already lost." As I walked out of the courthouse, I could hear the sound of helicopters in the distance, beginning another training exercise on land that would remain in my family for generations to come. Margaret Penworth had tried to kick me off my ranch. She'd just learned that some battles can't be won with suburban politics and developer money. Some battles require bigger guns than a homeowners association could ever hope to deploy 6 months later. I stood on my porch with my morning coffee, watching the sun rise over pastures that stretched unbroken to the horizon. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the only sounds were the gentle lowing of cattle and the distant hum of a helicopter conducting routine training. Exercises over land that had been in my family for 70 years and would remain so for 70 more. The Willowbrook Estates development was still there, of course, but it looked different now, smaller somehow, less imposing. The identical houses with their perfect lawns no longer seemed like an advancing army of suburban conformity. They were just houses, occupied by people who'd learned to coexist with something they couldn't control or regulate out of existence. Margaret Penworth was gone, of course. She'd resigned from the HOA presidency the day after the zoning review, claiming health issues that required her to step back from community involvement. Word around town was that she'd put her house on the market and moved to Arizona, where presumably she could find a retirement community that better suited her need for absolute control over her environment. The rest of the HOA board had followed her into political exile, replaced by more reasonable people who understood that being good neighbors meant respecting the rights of everyone in the community, not just the people who lived in identical houses with identical mailboxes. The harassment had stopped immediately after Captain Martinez's appearance at the courthouse. All those violation notices and fines had been quietly withdrawn. The surveillance had ended, and the county had issued a formal apology for any inconvenience caused by their incomplete understanding of the jurisdictional complexities involved. But the real victory wasn't just the end of the attacks on my ranch. It was the way the entire dynamic in the county had shifted. People had seen what happened when suburban arrogance went up against something older and more fundamental, the right to live according to your own values on your own land. Tom Rodriguez had been elected to the county commission in a special election, running on a platform of protecting agricultural heritage and limiting HOA overreach. Maria Santos had started a small business helping homeowners fight unreasonable association rules. And Dr. Richard Klein, Margaret's hired environmental consultant, had quietly left town after someone started asking uncomfortable questions about his credentials and methodology. The military lease had been renewed for another 10 years, with Captain Martinez personally overseeing the negotiations. The federal government, it turned out, was very interested in maintaining good relationships with property owners who could provide secure, private land for training exercises. They'd even offered to expand their operations, But I'd declined. My ranch was working land, not just a military facility, and I intended to keep it that way. The story had made the local papers, then the regional news, then national media as one of those David and Goliath tales that Americans love. I'd been interviewed by reporters from 3 different magazines, all wanting to know how a simple rancher had defeated a suburban homeowners association with military precision. The answer was simpler than they expected. I hadn't defeated them. They'd defeated themselves. Margaret Penworth and her supporters had been so convinced of their own righteousness, so certain that their vision of community perfection trumped everything else, that they'd never bothered to learn what they were really fighting against. They'd seen an old rancher with cattle and horses and assumed he was powerless against their suburban empire. They'd never imagined that the helicopters they complained about were the source of his power, not his vulnerability. But the real lesson wasn't about military contracts or federal jurisdiction. It was about the value of patience, of letting your enemies reveal their true intentions before you revealed your true strength. Margaret could have approached me at any time over the past 5 years, could have sat down over coffee and discussed her concerns like a reasonable neighbor. We might have found compromises, ways to address legitimate issues without destroying something that had taken generations to build. Instead, she'd chosen war. She'd decided that my family's legacy was an obstacle to her vision of suburban perfection, something to be legislated and regulated and bureaucratized out of existence. She'd learned too late that some things can't be destroyed by homeowners associations and county ordinances. Some things have deeper roots, stronger protections, and allies you never imagined. As I finished my coffee and prepared to start the day's work, I heard the familiar sound of gravel crunching in my driveway. A pickup truck was approaching, and as it got closer, I recognized the driver, Mrs. Garcia, the elderly woman whose house had also been a target of HOA harassment. She climbed out of her truck slowly, her weathered hands gripping a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Good morning, Mrs. Garcia," I called out. "What brings you by so early?" "I wanted to thank you, Mr. Harrison," she said, walking toward my porch with the careful dignity of someone who'd lived through enough history to understand the significance of what had happened. "What you did? It wasn't just about your ranch. It was about all of us." She handed me the package, and when I unwrapped it, I found a small wooden plaque with a simple inscription, "To those who stand their ground." "My grandfather made this for my father when he defended our family's store against some bullies during the Depression," she explained. "My father gave it to me when I had to fight to keep our house during the urban renewal projects in the 1960s. I want you to have it now." I held the plaque carefully, feeling the weight of the history it represented. "Mrs. Garcia, this is beautiful, but I can't take something so meaningful to your family." "Yes, you can," she said firmly, "because now you're part of that tradition. You stood your ground when someone tried to take away something that mattered. You showed the rest of us that it's possible to win these fights if you're smart enough and stubborn enough and patient enough." As she drove away, I looked at the plaque again, thinking about the generations of people who'd faced similar challenges, who'd found ways to protect what they valued against forces that seemed overwhelming. My grandfather had carved this ranch out of wilderness with nothing but determination and hard work. My father had expanded it through economic downturns and agricultural challenges that would have broken weaker men. Now it was my turn to be a link in that chain, to protect the family legacy and pass it on to the next generation. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of helicopter blades, not the harbinger of trouble they'd once seemed to Margaret Penworth, but the rhythm of security, the beat of protection that would keep this land safe for generations to come. I mounted Mrs. Garcia's plaque beside my front door, where it would remind me every day that some battles are worth fighting, some ground is worth holding, and some victories are about more than just winning. They're about preserving the right to be different in a world that increasingly demands conformity. The ranch stood tall, as it always had, as it always would. The helicopters flew their training missions over land that had been home to 3 generations of Harrisons and would be home to 3 more. And somewhere in Arizona, Margaret Penworth was probably trying to organize another homeowners association, never understanding that the real power doesn't come from rules and regulations and committee meetings. Real power comes from roots that go deeper than any subdivision, from commitments that outlast any political campaign, and from the simple, stubborn refusal to let anyone else dictate how you live on your own land. They'd tried to break me. Instead, they'd broken themselves. My ranch still stood, and it always would. The sound of helicopters faded into the distance, and I walked back into my house to start another day of doing exactly what my grandfather and father had done before me, taking care of the land, tending to the animals, and preserving a way of life that was older than any homeowners association and would outlast all of them. Some victories echo through generations. This was one of them.